So, Gareth, with no further ado, please, I'm looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone. I'm going to try to combine my talk with a PowerPoint presentation, and I'm hoping that you can see the first image up on your screen. And Jonathan, maybe you can you'll obviously let me know if there's any technical problems, if either there's no progression of the PowerPoint or if my voice goes or something else. But anyway, it's a shame not to be actually with you. Like, it's a shame we can't share a room together, but it's very exciting to join you anyway, and it's very, very exciting to be joining UCL. It's a huge adventure, and I'm very honored to be joining you and very much looking forward to it. So my aim is to talk relatively briefly, maybe for 20-25 minutes, about the US response to COVID, and can history help us to understand the current crisis. The Trump administration response to this crisis is so remarkable that it's tempting to think that it lies completely outside of history, or at least outside of the American political tradition. But is this a wholly exceptional story? And my argument is that it isn't. That in fact, in certain important respects, we can see the current crisis as the culmination of a process, a historical process in American responses to disaster, going back at least a half century or so. Now, I should say right at the get-go that in my research, I'm not directly concerned, for the most part, with epidemics, and the reason for that is simply one of asymmetry. That big epidemics, in a way, more resemble wars or economic depressions in their effects, in their impact, in their implications, than they do any of my natural disasters. I say my natural disasters because I've got quite possessive of them over the many years that I've been working on this project. But the deadliest of my natural disasters, a hurricane that hit Galveston, Texas in 1900, cost 6,000 lives. The Great Flu epidemic of 1918 cost an estimated 675,000 lives out of a population in the US at that time of 100 million. But I nonetheless think that the historical story that I tell does have some pertinence to the current response to COVID in a number of respects. And I want to talk about 3 or 4 parallels that I see between my research and the current crisis. First of all, that modern natural disasters very frequently generate political controversy. They didn't used to. It used to be very atypical, but during the last half century, disasters have become increasingly contentious. Second, during the last half century, presidential leadership has become much more central to how the nation responds to disaster than it used to be. So that's an important change. It's an important change in part because of the effect this has on public policy, because what I want to argue is that presidential leadership frequently results during a disaster in the marginalization of expertise and often has very unfortunate public policy consequences. The parallel that I want to draw between my research and the current crisis is that disasters throughout American history have tended to have very disparate ethno-racial impacts, as of course the COVID crisis has. The big difference during the last half century is that this is noticed. It becomes part of the political conversation in a way that it wasn't before about the late 60s or the early 1970s. And the final point, I may not get this far, but we can always take it up in the Q&A. I think if you look at recent presidencies, it would be possible to make the case for Clinton, for both Bushes, for Obama, and maybe now for Trump as well, that disasters can really make a decisive difference to a presidency. Like I say, happy to talk about that in response to questions. Right, I think I'm ready to move on now. Oh, moved on too much. That's not very good. Here we are. So the first of my themes, that disasters are now frequently controversial in a way that they didn't used to be. Yeah, so it's become common, not just with COVID, but ever since roughly the early 1970s, to present the governmental response to disaster as being a disaster in its own right. It's become quite common to talk about the disaster after the disaster. Often it's been FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, that has been in the firing line, but presidents too have sometimes come under fire for lack of leadership or for inept leadership. Like I say, this is quite a distinct pattern in terms of the larger sweep of US history. So what is going on here? Why should it be the case that during the last 50 years, disasters have become increasingly contentious and have increasingly in ways that have discomforted successive presidents? And my central claim will be that there's a straightforward explanation for this, and it is that Americans now have increasingly high expectations of their government when disaster strikes, but they have increasingly high expectations of a government that they simultaneously hold in contempt. And so let me take each part of that statement in turn. First of all, the historical process whereby Americans now expect more from their federal government and from their president when disaster strikes than used to be the case. I mean, if we look at that flu epidemic in 1918, there was a fairly significant federal response in the sense that the Public Health Service was actively involved, trying to cooperate with local governments and states in responding to this terrible disaster. But Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, literally didn't make a single statement about this ghastly epidemic that killed 675,000 people. Life is very different now. So what's the explanation? Let me try and move on to my next slide. What I'm interested in my book is the idea that between the early republic and the present day, Americans' attitude towards risk and hence towards disaster changes fundamentally. What I want to argue is that in the early republic, life for American settlers was extremely precarious. They were surrounded by risk, and that encouraged a certain fatalism, maybe stoicism, in the face of disaster. But over time, this has yielded to what I call a developing culture of security, an expectation that disasters that used to be just taken for granted, that's just the way it is, the expectation that disasters can either be prevented or at least can be ameliorated through collective action and through the application of expertise. Specifically, Americans increasingly looked to government to protect them not just from Indians, but from epidemic disease, from flooding, from crop failure, from insect infestations, and then come the New Deal in the 1930s, from economic insecurity. So in this new environment, in this culture of security, which doesn't progress all of a sudden, but develops over time during the 19th century and during the early 20th century, disasters that used to seem sort of what you'd expect, not all that surprising, they over time start to seem shocking and unnatural. And my next slide, I hope, is quite revealing. I hope you can see that. That's rather small print, but I can see it, so maybe you can too. So if we ask ourselves why Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was such a very shocking event, I think that part of the reason is because disasters that kill 1,800 people are simply not supposed to happen anymore in the United States. And in fact, if you look at the list of the 10 deadliest US natural disasters in American history at the time of Katrina in 2005, then I'm sorry, that slide has gone rather wonky. The dates have gone rather wonky. So forgive me for that, but I hope you can make some sort of sense out of that anyway. But if you can, you will see what an outlier Hurricane Katrina is, because all of the other deadliest natural disasters on that list happened in the late 19th century or in the early 20th century. None of the other ones, I think, are later than 1935. So this is thanks largely to things like flood and hurricane barriers, improved weather forecasting, radar, efficient evacuations procedures, better communications. All of these things mean that disasters become a lot less deadly than they had done before. And by the 1950s, it's commonplace for scientists and elected politicians to predict the final conquest of disaster, the final conquest of nature through weather control. Here's a nice magazine front page from the mid-1950s that anticipates a new era of weather control, that floods, disasters, hurricanes could maybe be prevented altogether. Or in a rather sinister way, this article, inside article in that issue of Collier's, suggests that maybe weather can also be used as a Cold War weapon. You can create floods, create droughts in the Soviet Union or in China. Anyway, this sense that although we're not there yet, we're on a sort of historical process that involves progress, and that means that we can expect this trajectory, this heartening trajectory, to continue. Loss of life, already becoming less common than it used to be, will become even less common than that. Public health seems to, I mean, I should emphasize I'm not an expert on this, but public health seems to fit this pattern, with the polio vaccine capping a series of dramatic mid-century triumphs for federal disease control that left the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health among the most admired and well-funded federal agencies. But all this does create a potential problem in mid-century America. What if things go wrong? What if a levee fails? What if a dam fails? What if the US Weather Bureau makes a mistake, as it did, for example, in 1957, when Hurricane Audrey was approaching the Louisiana coast? The Weather Bureau told people in the southwest Louisiana coast that they had 12 hours before they needed to worry about the hurricane hitting. The hurricane sped up, hit the Louisiana coast 8 hours ahead of predictions, and 600 people died. So what's going to happen in that sort of situation? These expectations have the potential to create problems when things go wrong. Well, yeah, but it didn't actually matter that much politically. The politically consensual, Ewan may disagree with this, he's free to come back at me. He and Robert Mason have edited a very good book on this, but in a comparatively consensual political world of the Eisenhower and the Kennedy years, it only really becomes heightened, this risk, when failure occurs against a backdrop of wider suspicion of government, such as has characterized American life since the late 1960s. So here's a graph that I hope you can see. You'll probably at least be able to see the overall direction of travel. This is a Pew Trust. Gallup did very similar polls that asked the American people every year, do you trust the government to do what is right just about always or most of the time? And you will see roughly that in 1964, when LBJ has his amazing election victory over Barry Goldwater, that popular faith in the federal government exceeds 80%. You'll see that it drops below 50% about 1972, and then it bottoms out below 30% at 1979. So if you want to understand why Jimmy Carter doesn't win re-election, you can see that 1980 wasn't a great year for an incumbent president to be standing for re-election. Anyway, my argument is that the sorts of problems that disaster management had always generated from time to time now fit a larger narrative of governmental failure. And that connection first becomes apparent, to my mind, in 1972 in relation to a hurricane that you might not have heard of called Hurricane Agnes, which, as a tropical storm, deluges central Pennsylvania, also upstate New York. The worst damage is in central Pennsylvania, where the Susquehanna River overflows its banks and causes massive urban flooding. Not very much loss of life, but enormous property damage, very high levels of temporary homelessness. And this becomes a huge political hot potato for the Nixon administration in an election year. It's not at all clear to me that the Nixon administration's response to Hurricane Agnes is peculiarly bad or peculiarly inept, but it creates a firestorm of controversy that in the first instance affects George Romney, who was the housing secretary, father of Mitt Romney, and controversy centers on the difficulty that the federal government has in supplying flood refugees with trailer homes. And becomes a big political football. But I think what's particularly interesting about it is the context. It's not just that it becomes a political football, but it becomes a political football at a time when newspapers articles about Hurricane Agnes, the same issue will feature stories about Spiro Agnew, the vice president, rampaging around the country trying to rile the silent majority of Americans against liberals and against commie pinko subversives and against George McGovern. It's a time when the American position in Vietnam is completely collapsing. It's actually the very same week, incidentally, as the Watergate break-in. But here's the sort of newspaper coverage that people would see. On the right, there's an article about the federal response to Hurricane Agnes, and then next to it is this very, very famous and distressing image from the Vietnam War of a poor little girl who's been napalmed by the South Vietnamese Air Force. And I would argue that although that was a particularly febrile moment in American politics, the Nixon era, that actually disasters have continued to be politically contentious ever since. And this has resulted in presidents becoming far more central to disaster management than before, because for the simple reason that much more is at stake and the risk of sustaining political damage is far greater for Nixon and his successors than it ever was for, say, Eisenhower or for Kennedy. In fact, dealing with disaster has been a federal responsibility for a long time, but until the 1960s and 1970s, it was largely a bureaucratic responsibility. Involved agencies such as the Small Business Administration or the Bureau of Public Roads. When disaster struck, their bureaucrats would work with elected officials to get federal resources to the scene. But during the last half century, presidents become much more to the fore, eager to convey empathy, eager to visit the scene, as Nixon did twice, once by just a helicopter visit, then in person, as he did at the time of Hurricane Agnes, desperate to avoid being personally implicated in whatever problems might arise. This first affects public health politics in 1976, another election year, when the Centers for Disease Control warned the White House of the possibility that a new strain of swine flu, similar to that of 1918, might be starting to emerge. Now, not all CDC experts agreed that this was a serious threat, but Ford, who was in the middle of a very difficult primary fight with Ronald Reagan, he jumps on the issue right away, invests major resources in a high-profile bid to develop a vaccine in time for the flu season, which would be getting underway just as he was going to be facing the electorate. In the event, the epidemic did not materialize, can't even say it, and a number of Americans died after taking the hurriedly developed vaccine, creating a flap that probably didn't help Ford's re-election prospects. Okay, so what effect has this growing presidential role in disaster management had on actual public policy? And my argument is that it often results in very bad public policy, that presidential leadership very often involves sidelining the experts and in poor policy choices. The sidelining of Anthony Fauci's task force during the past 6 weeks might constitute an extreme case. It's actually a very common general pattern for experts to be sidelined following a disaster. I don't think this is particularly hard to understand. It's because presidents, they see disaster almost exclusively through the prism of their own personal and immediate political needs. And this often comes at the expense of sound public policy, particularly when a president is campaigning for re-election, as is the case now, and as was the case in the autumn of 1979, when Jimmy Carter visited the Alabama Gulf Coast following Hurricane Frederick. Now, Carter, as you may know, was a big environmentalist president, and one of his signature issues was that he wished to reduce incentives for development in hazardous coastal locations, especially barrier islands that maybe were chronically subject to flooding or occasionally to hurricanes. But Alabama was a state that Carter had won in 1976, where his popularity had since nosedived, and which he badly wanted to win in 1980. When he visits Alabama, he tells the governor, Fob James, we will rebuild Gulf Shores, we will rebuild Dauphin Island, as it's called, bigger and better than ever. And so this island, Dauphin Island, which is off the Alabama Gulf Coast, is chronically subject to hurricanes. And at the time of Hurricane Frederick, only about 2,000 people lived there. And at FEMA and NOAA, the oceanographic agency, they saw a great opportunity when the bridge connecting Dauphin Island to the mainland was destroyed by the hurricane. They said, great, we won't rebuild the bridge. We'll just have a ferry connection. That will work perfectly well. And it will be a significant disincentive to renewed investment in this chronically vulnerable area. What happens instead is that Jimmy Carter commits his administration to rebuilding the bridge with twice the capacity that it had before. And this results in a building boom in Alabama, in Dauphin Island, which has regularly been hit by hurricanes with substantial property damage ever since. So coming towards the end now, but my next theme has to do with the racial politics of disaster. So the disproportionate impact of COVID on African Americans and on Native Americans has been widely noted. Last week's Economist noted that African Americans who become infected with COVID are 2.4 times as likely to die as are whites who become infected. Now, this fits a historical pattern that has very deep roots. Research on past US natural disasters reveals disparate racial impacts to be a ubiquitous theme. But what is relatively recent is the fact that minority suffering is now noticed in a way that it didn't used to be, because throughout American history, up until the late 1960s, Black suffering generally did not register in either political or media responses to disaster. When Hurricane Betsy struck New Orleans as late as 1965, for example, 90% of fatalities were Black, a far higher percentage than after Katrina. But this did not become a political issue or a media talking point. It simply was not noticed. So I argue in my book that one of the accomplishments of the African American freedom struggle of the 1960s, and also of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, was to make Black suffering in disaster visible for the first time in American history. And you could argue that coverage of Katrina, as when Wolf Blitzer reported from New Orleans in 2005 and saw these blurry images and said in a tone of shock, "They are so poor, they are so Black." That, and the fact that African American suffering is noticed in the context of the COVID crisis, might be seen as the culmination of this recent historical pattern. However, and maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A, it's far less clear to me that this new visibility has translated into minority political power in any enduring way. I think there was a temporary impact in the late 60s, early 70s, but it doesn't seem to have endured. Okay, so now by conclusion, I want to just mention two aspects of the current crisis that do strike me as being entirely or very largely unique. Firstly, we seem to be seeing the possible rebirth by force of circumstance rather than by design of a robust and quite encouraging model of federalism. Current news coverage and more reflective articles in places like Atlantic Monthly, including a very good one a few weeks ago by Gary Gerstle, suggest that states, counties, and municipalities have, to a very considerable degree, managed to fill the void left by lack of federal leadership or by actively destructive federal leadership. Now, if true, this completely reverses the entire trajectory of American disaster politics during the past 70 years, which has been characterized by growing and in recent decades almost total reliance on federal leadership. So if one enduring impact of Trump's leadership were to be a rebalancing of the federal, state and local roles in disaster response. That would probably be quite a beneficial unintended outcome, given that the current federal role in responding to disaster is so frequently counterproductive, and given that effective response to any local or regional disaster, such as those I'm concerned with in my book, must, in the first instance, inescapably rest on competent and fleet-footed leadership by subnational governments. And then my sort of final point, presidents responding to disaster, I've argued, always pursue what they perceive to be their personal self-interest. However, Trump's conception of his political self-interest is wholly unique. For in the past, including in the recent past, the norm has been to try to project empathy rather than to use crisis as an opportunity for further inflaming existing divisions within society. That brings me to George W. Bush and Katrina. Although he was widely panned for his response to Katrina, Bush thought he was following a standard model when he flew over New Orleans following Katrina, and did so less ineptly a few weeks later when he gave an emotional speech in Jackson Square, emphasizing his personal fondness for the city and its people and committing his administration to rebuilding New Orleans. So it's a remarkable testament to the distinctive contribution of Donald Trump to disaster management that we can now look back almost with fondness and nostalgia on George W. Bush's response to Hurricane Katrina. Those were the days. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Gareth, for that very stimulating talk. And we've got some time for questions and discussion. So there's the hand raise feature in the bottom middle of everyone's screen. So if you're able to put that up, I will, and then you've got the microphone thing you can unmute next to it on the bottom center. So Tom.
Hi. I don't know if I was slightly late. Hi, Tom Packer, honorary fellow here, as I think Gareth knows me well, so I don't think he needs much explanation. I don't think I'm able to switch on my video. That was, as always, a really interesting and stimulating talk on this. I was just thinking, going to, for now at least, going to say, suggest something on public opinion and something on Congress. One is a specific point, which is if you look at Bush's falling ratings, they fell just as fast before and after Katrina. Probably due to the Iraq War, so it's not clear. It got him a lot of bad press, but it's not clear how much it actually drove his popularity down. But in terms of public opinion, is what we're seeing here partly increased expectations? In that, it seems to me one way of looking at your story is that you get to a situation where expected government will do things, and then instead of people being grateful for the president, they start complaining about the president. And the second is Congress was very silent in the story, I think. And it seemed to me quite a big part of it is presumably this is exactly the kind of thing Congress likes spending money on like water. And I think that is something to think about in the context of what's happened in coronavirus, in that surely spending on coronavirus has got to be higher than all other disasters in American history put together. So that's a very substantial thing the federal government's done, for better or worse, in response. So it's the Congress and also public opinion expectations.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm very, very perceptive comments. I don't know very much about Congress's role in responding to the COVID crisis, so I won't talk about that. I'd be very interested to know if other people sort of have a view about that. In terms of my story more generally, I would say that often what I've said about presidents in general applies to elected politicians more generally. So yes, you're right, Tom, that on the whole, legislators and presidents are sort of on the same page, that in the heat of a disaster, long-term questions of mitigation and disaster prevention go out of the window. And generally speaking, all of the emphasis is on spending money, helping people to rebuild their lives, rebuilding infrastructure. And so it's not just presidents whose role has the effect of sidelining experts, it's probably the exigencies of electoral politics more generally in the kind of rather populist majoritarian context of American democratic politics that helps to explain that pattern. Thank you.
Kevin.
Gareth, thank you very much both for a very stimulating presentation on a really important topic, and welcome very much to the Institute.
Thank you, Kevin.
If it turns out that the COVID crisis does represent a shift toward a new federalism where disaster relief is concerned,
yeah.
Will that be because of the Trump factor and his unique or somewhat different response to it, or because it's a public health disaster, unlike the natural disasters that you were talking about?
Yeah.
And health policy does ultimately fall to the states for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, of course, I don't know because it's talking about the future, but it seems to me that the fact that cities like San Francisco, through an early lockdown, have been able to limit death toll to 40, there are these sort of very interesting sort of state variations in mortality. I find it hard to believe that there won't be some sort of larger take-home message. If I'm right in thinking, that the federal role in responding to smaller scale disasters has not only become contentious, but has been contentious in part because it has often been sort of inept, bureaucratic, damaging. I think if you put that trajectory together with the various sort of heartening lessons of COVID in terms of successful state and local leadership, then I think it makes every sense that this would have some sorts of enduring effects. Sorry, that's a bit of a waffle, but I don't know how better to answer that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paolo?
Just to go back to Kevin's question and maybe just suggest a potential avenue for research, it might be interesting to compare what's happened in the US with what's happening in Brazil, where I think what you're the picture you're painting also is evident in the sense that with Bolsonaro really not taking the pandemic seriously, this has created space for governors to play a much more active role. So there too, federalism seems to be a major factor in how the pandemic is playing out.
And how would that fit into a historical pattern in the case of Brazil?
I think Malo would be a better place than me to answer that.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
If Malu wanted to come in there or not.
Hi, sorry.
Hi. Hi, Alexandra. Come ahead, go ahead.
Hi, Gareth. Thank you very much for your talk. This is really interesting. As Paulo was saying, the federal dynamics in Brazil are also very interesting and similar to what you're saying in the context of, when you have a more incompetent federal government, municipalities and state, and governors gaining political capital. I think that one of the big differences, and then historically that also matters, is that institutions of federalism, especially when it comes to budgets, are distributed quite differently in the context of Brazil. And so coalitional presidentialism has worked in such a way that has in a lot of ways determined the level of influence that mayors and governors have, or the level of money, etc. And so I think that those institutional dynamics offer an interesting contrast, even if there are all of these parallels of federalism and subnational units. And so perhaps it would be looking at institutional changes, but also moments of critical junctures. And critical junctures here perhaps provide this historical framework to analyze the ways or the moments in which subnational units might have had greater or lesser levels of influence.
Thank you very much, Malu. I'd love to pick your brain further about that at some point.
We'll talk for sure.
Alexandra.
Hiya. I just wanted to say about, obviously you mentioned the impact of things like Hurricane Katrina on Black Americans, and obviously now in the context of coronavirus, especially with Americans getting that, well, some Americans only getting that $1,200 check and stuff. Do you think economically and both like through like the racial perspective, do you think in the context of coronavirus, you said the Black people have been getting like more attention and stuff, media maybe. Do you think that's gotten better since Katrina, or obviously with like the divisive nature of Trump, it's gotten worse? I just wanted to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you, Alexandra. I mean, I'm not sure that I have a particularly sort of informed view of that. I'd be interested to know what you think. My impression is that I haven't picked up any sense that it's got worse. I mean, the point I was trying to make in my talk was that there seems to me to be perennial difficulty in converting visibility into actual concrete federal resources, and I think that probably is something that has got worse over time, Alexandra. So I'm not so sure about public opinion, but in terms of the actual practical politics of it, I think that's something that might well have deteriorated. If you think about Hurricane Katrina, of course, the discriminatory effect on African Americans became a really central part of the political story. But when you look at how the federal resources were spent, they were spent disproportionately on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which is actually very, very heavily white, the Mississippi Gulf Coast, at the expense of areas of Louisiana that were heavily black and that were much more adversely affected. So I think that's a deterioration since the Great Society era, since the Johnson and Nixon period, when African Americans acquired not just visibility, but the sort of political voice that could give them influence when disaster struck. And I see that in my research in the late 60s and early 1970s, and I've sort of struggled to pick it up in relation to subsequent disasters. So I think that ultimately was a rather, I'm afraid, a rather ephemeral moment. I'm sorry I can't say more about public opinion, Alexandra.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Luke.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great, okay. A large part of your talk was about expectations of response, and I wondered, in light of that, maybe it's kind of a partly two-pronged question. I wondered, in light of that, whether are those expectations held by the public unreasonable, or is it just a case that the response has, on occasion, the border's been dropped, and there are other examples and where the response has been actually very good, and whether those expectations are kind of unrealistic? And that's part one of my. The part two, if I may be so bold as to have a second question, is what role?
Do you want to ask your second in a bit? Because otherwise I'm just going to forget the first.
All right, of course, absolutely.
In fact, I'm not sure I haven't already forgotten the first. But no, it's whether these expectations are
reasonable, and whether it's a case that expectations have been raised throughout a president or an administration's term, and then people have had their expectations kind of brought crashing down to earth with a response, and whether there's been another response throughout that time which has actually been very good, and it's just occasionally they are lapsed in their response.
Yeah, I don't want to sound too overly schematic about it, but taking that risk, I would say that from the early Republic through till about the 1960s, there was a rough kind of equilibrium between what people expected from their government when disaster struck and its actual capacity to deliver. I think since roughly the Johnson presidency, there have been more occasions where the limits of governmental capacity to help have become evident. And I think I suggested in my talk, that's partly just because the overall environment is so anti-government. So these things are noticed in a way they weren't before. But I think as well that it's a case that government had got so big and so bureaucratic by the 1970s that it became really quite rigid and sort of muscle bound, and was much less able to act sort of swiftly and supplely and in a kind of flexible, alert sort of way. I mean, I've looked at various records from the 1950s having to do with Hurricane Audrey, which I mentioned briefly in my talk, and I'm really struck by the degree to which bureaucrats in particular agencies knew one another. They'd pick up the phone, talk to one another, say, okay, so here's the problem. What are we going to do about it? And there was a sort of degree of relative simplicity to government, and a degree of human to human interaction, and a degree of non-rigidity, like just ask the question, what do we need to help? Let's do it. Whereas if you go forward to the 1970s, you don't see that as much, and certainly governors tearing their hair out by the 1970s, the fact that government is spending enormous amounts of money on disaster relief, but governors really struggle to know, who do I call about this? Why are you doing this? You're doing that, but you're not talking to each other. You're not coordinating what you're doing. So I suspect that actually government capacity has reduced since the 1960s compared to 1950s, and it's partly because government is just trying to do so much more than it was trying to do in the 1950s, so things necessarily become more complicated. What was your second question?
My second question was that we're often told now that we're living in a kind of post-truth era in politics, and it's very difficult for people to discern what's real and what isn't. And I wondered if that would be reasonably expected to have an impact on what the populace could expect as a response from their government when it pertains to a disaster.
You mean what effect it would have on public attitudes?
Well, because if you take the current administration, presumably they're regularly told, depending on the outlet they consume it from, they're regularly told that everything's fine and it's all going to be great. So does that have a meaningful impact on what they expect? Is my point.
I bet it does. I bet it does. I mean, I think it makes a massive difference. Both the shift to 24-hour news that you start to see. Early 90s, the first time I see it in my story is something called Hurricane Andrew in 1992, and that leads to the emergence of something called CNN syndrome, and live television feeds really start to have a sort of decisive impact on media coverage. I think as well, so that the speeding up, the greater immediacy, visual shock, social media, all that makes a difference. The other thing, I suppose, is the shift from, I think people say the shift from broadcasting to narrowcasting. That during the 1950s, when Hurricane Audrey took place, which I've mentioned a couple of times, actually the federal response was pretty inept. That wasn't really captured on the few dominant media outlets of the day, so the issue just sort of died in a way that would be much less likely today. So I think it's not just the polarization of media, but also just the proliferation of media that is fundamentally transformative to disaster politics. And thanks for your questions, Luke.
Thank you. Stephen, you had your hand up earlier, and it sort of went down, but it's back up. Do you want to ask it now?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for a really stimulating talk. So my question is, you mentioned briefly the possibility that COVID will lead to a kind of new federalism and the possibility of that leading to a more competent response to disasters. Given that state and local budgets have been eviscerated by COVID, though, I was wondering how far you think that will actually be possible, how far they may have to rely on congressional appropriations in order to do that.
That's a very good question. I don't know. I mean, what do you know about that story, about the degree to which state and local resources have been eviscerated?
So it's just media reports suggesting there are going to be fairly substantial cuts. And obviously there was the comment coming from Republican senators that states should just go bankrupt rather than pay the costs.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I mean, just off the top of my head, I wonder if it probably be the case in Britain, don't you think, that local governments would be much more sort of incapacitated or enfeebled by that sort of historical pattern, probably, than in the US. I mean, I would just guess that US states continue to have greater tax raising power and authority than a local authority or a council would have in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be interesting to think about that in comparative terms.
Naomi, do you have a question?
Yes. Thank you for the talk as well. It was really interesting.
You're welcome.
How would you explain how many people expect a strong response from their government, but then do not follow the guidelines that the government puts in place for them?
I have literally no more basis for answering that question than anyone else in the room. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you have a view about that?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying about how people have a higher expectation of their government now, and the idea that they also, especially in America, they have this high degree that they feel they should be able to rely on themselves and have certain freedoms. Because I know in California that's a big thing where there were very strong lockdowns, but then a lot of people think that they should make their own choices on whether they start up their business again.
I think that's a very good point, Naomi. It's this paradox, isn't it, again, of it feeling entitled to large amounts of government aid, but also adhering very firmly to these anti-statist sort of political views. So this combination of, like my residents of Dauphin Island, Alabama, who are all no doubt very, very conservative Republicans, when there's a disaster, they expect Washington to bail them out with billions of dollars. But if the federal government knocks on their door and says, okay, we'll give you some money, but there are strings attached to it, you can't build a house right on the beach, or you've got to put it on stilts. They say, this is America. We're not living in some kind of communist state. Get out of the way. So I think, anyway, I think you saw sort of an interesting contrast there that in a way goes to the heart of American political culture.
Right, thank you. We've got time for one more question, and it looks like Tom would like to have another question. So Tom, would you like to?
First word and the last word.
Sorry, I'm very happy to give way to anyone else.
It was ever thus.
It was just it was partly at the risk of sounding like a congressional monomania. It struck me that one reason why Mississippi got more funds than Louisiana might be because the Mississippi senators, Thad Cochran of the Appropriations Committee and Trent Lott, who were so powerful, and the Gulf Coast is Trent Lott's base, and also the congressman for the Gulf Coast of Mississippi was a very conservative Democrat who represented a very endangered district. So I think it's interesting to think how the congressional framework might explain some of these racial disparities. I was also going to say, in terms of putting coronavirus in this context, isn't part of the reason why it's so state focused, got very little, I think this links a bit what I was saying about funding earlier being so high, that disease, the states have always fundamentally been in charge. We just haven't had a pandemic or a something socially constructed as a pandemic, if you prefer, for 100 years. So, and the other thing about politics is, and this fits very well with what Naomi was saying, is you're forcing people not to do stuff. So it's one thing to give endless money and have Uncle Sam pull the tab. It's another thing to be restricting people going to church, going on Black Lives Matters demonstrations, having their businesses. And that's always going to be more politically difficult in the areas affected. So I was wondering to what degree the federalism and the controversy is more a product of the nature of the disaster.
Maybe so. I don't really know. I mean, in terms of the point you make, if I just adjust one of those points, the one about state leadership in public health, because that's come up a couple of times. I mean, I recognize that, but I think that the overall trajectory I describe is as true for public health as it is for other disasters. Really, I mean, I mentioned the swine flu scare of 1976. That was going to be followed up by Legionnaire's disease, and then AIDS, and then a series of other viruses. Since then, there were 3 virus scares under Obama: the Zika virus, H1N1, and Ebola. And so I think there has been a sort of trajectory. There's a sort of new era, both of dangerous viruses and of political concern about dangerous viruses. There was a particular book that I jotted down the details that came out in 1994 that won a Pulitzer Prize, and it was called The Coming Plague by someone called Laurie Garrett. And I think the trajectory over the last half century has been towards a greater concern about epidemic disease, which I think was something that Americans in general, and including experts, including medical experts, had become very sanguine about between the 1940s and the early 1970s. I was reading an article in the Atlantic Monthly, I think, about a big infectious diseases doc who was giving a speech to a graduating class of about 300, and this was in the mid-70s, and he said, I don't know what you're all going to do unless you're going to infect one another and then just do bizarre tests or something like that. So there was this sort of sense that this era of epidemics and pandemic threats had was in the past, and then since the late 70s, that's not been the case. And I think with that has come a growing reliance on the feds through until about the Obama administration. But then, in fact, funding for the public health service, for the Centers for Disease Control, really tanked. Mostly once Republicans took control of Congress, I think 2 years into the Obama presidency, and that process hasn't been reversed since then. So there may, Tom, there may, just because of that diminution in resources, be a sort of default reassertion of a kind of state primacy in public health that I think you don't find as much between the late 70s and the Obama presidency.
Interesting. Thanks as always, Gareth. Very interesting.
Yes, and I'd like to join Tom in saying thanks ever so much, Gareth, for a really interesting and stimulating paper. And it's made me even more excited that you're joining us in July as Professor of US History. Really exciting work that you're doing.
Well,
I look forward to hear more of it.